There are some very weird changes coming for the Death Guard out of the new chapter approved, perhaps an overall nerf to the army, yet someone in their wisdom decided that Plague Burst Crawlers weren't good enough and needed quite a big buff. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where when going through the points changes from the new chapter approved, I thought we'd go for the Death Guard next. It seems an appropriate next one to record, as Nurgle's Blight very much seems to have reached my vocal cords. I'm sorry about the flesh being quite so weak. In any case, generally I'm fairly positive on chapter approved and Games Workshop's rebalancing. Even if they don't get everything right, they do usually leave codexes more balanced than they were before. But really I think that this is one of the set of changes that's least impressive out of any of the codexes they've looked at. Quite a big general nerf to a faction that I'm not really sure needed one, as well as making one of their best datasheets even more of an auto-include than it already was. In general, in 9th edition, I think the Death Guard were monstrously strong when their codex first dropped. When it came out, perhaps the strongest faction in the entire game for a little bit, though the release was fairly rapidly followed up by Drakari and Admech, which kind of made Death Guard feel fine in comparison. After those books, the new Sisters, new Grey Knights and new Orcs, I'd say Death Guard are more sort of an upper middle tier faction, certainly with some solid lists that could make them very competitive, but certainly not topping events all over the place and really dominating the meta. Certainly stronger than the few remaining books that don't have 9th edition codexes, but that's kind of generally true of any 9th edition codex versus any 8th edition one now. It really does seem that someone at Games Workshop though decided that Death Guard just needed a big general nerf, with 5 of their most competitive units getting toned down, one small buff to a lesser played unit, and then the Plague Burst Crawler change, which is just a bit weird. I think perhaps these codex changes are an indication of when they were written for chapter approved. I think usually Games Workshop needs to lock in what they're printing a good few months in advance, and I think that Games Workshop in general are a little bit slow to learn exactly which of their armies are really dominating, and which ones were dominating but are rapidly becoming less and less of a problem. I think perhaps Death Guard are paying a price for their early success. In any case, if we do go on to go through the changes individually, the first is to the Foul Blight spawn, going up 15 points to 90, a pretty hefty 20% rise. I'd say out of any of the changes, this one was perhaps one of the ones I might have seen coming the most. Both him and the Tallyman seem to be a near auto-include in the vast majority of competitive Death Guard lists at the moment, with those Stench Vats just having an enormous aura of fights last makes them a real pain to approach, particularly in conjunction with some fighty Death Guard characters or small squads that are easy to cover like Death Shroud Terminators. That enormous buff plus a decent damage dealing weapon really is a nice combo. I think he still remains pretty decent at 90 points. I still feel like he's going to get taken. I think perhaps more in the theme of just general nerfs to the army are both the sets of Terminators going up a bit. The Blight Lord Terminators go by plus 2 points to 42 points each, a 5% increase, and the Death Shroud Terminators get hit particularly hard, going up 5 points to 55. This is absolutely definitely going to hurt Death Guard lists. Terminators are generally one of the best infantry ways to deal damage out of the whole codex, and I felt like that was kind of an appropriate role for them really. The Death Guard don't really have all that many core units. The Terminators are the elite of the elite, and I feel like they should be the exact type of unit that you want to have on the front line. I think they both still remain usable, and perhaps are a bit better balanced against each other now. I did tend to see more people using Death Shroud than Blight Lords, but still it's going to be a lot more painful whenever a Terminator goes down and you lose all that investment. They're very tough against some things, perhaps a bit less so against others. In another truly quite painful change to the codex, Poxwalkers are going up to 6 points from 5, which doesn't really sound like too much on the face for it, just 1 point up, but that does mean that it's a massive 20% points nerf in perspective if you are spamming them in big units. I feel like Poxwalkers are one of the units where their stats were really quite good for 5-point models, much better than most other armies, but at the same time they weren't units that you could absolutely spam for days. You needed a core Death Guard unit for every single unit of Poxwalkers that you included, and that prevented the spam of them from getting too silly already, even if you were really trying to make the absolute most out of them and running that Terminus S Strike Force from the Charadon books. I felt that was a really quite nice competitive build, but still not exactly overbearing compared with some of the other nasty things out there in the meta. I think just in general, between these nerfs to Poxwalkers and the Terminators, this just really makes the Terminus S Strike Force build so much worse, and I feel like they're probably taking it from an interesting different way to play Death Guard competitively to a much less optimal way to play the army. Between Terminators and Poxwalkers, I believe most of those lists will go up somewhere between 100 and 200 points, so you'd have to trim down some really quite big units. Finally, in a more general change for the game, the Volkite Contemptor of course went up, 10 points each for twin Volkite Culverins. So for example, the build without the Cyclone missile launchers goes up to 170 from 150. In competitive lists, these were being seen absolutely loads, along with the Plague Burst Crawler, one of the best sources of firepower in the Codex, and just worked spectacularly well with the Tallyman, who could give them some pretty spectacular buffs between exploding 6s from Tollkeeper and making 1+1 to hit and farm command points. Maybe they chose not to tone down the Tallyman due to the change to the Contemptor perhaps. In any case, he still seems to remain a very good buffing piece though. Maybe he might be put to work with Lascannon Contemptors as an alternative. The Volkites are still good and very generalist, though definitely a lot more expensive and not as much of an auto-include. Still though, while I do think the Death Guard as an army are generally weaker after this, it really isn't all bad news, as a couple of units also got some pretty significant buffs. First up is the very nice -15 point drop to the Plague Burst Crawler. If you deck it out with the Entropy Cannons, it goes down to 160 points from 175, and I just feel like it's a really strange buff to one of the best datasheets in the Codex. These things were an example of tank units done right in 40k, I thought. Not many external buffs, but strong enough to get by on their own merit, really tough, some decent anti-tank shooting, and of course some very helpful ignores line of sight. Particularly in the context of nerfs to most of the other units, I think that 3 Plague Burst Crawlers are now pretty much an auto-include in the most competitive Death Guard lists. They're just really efficient for what they do. One theory that I've seen is that Games Workshop might have brought them down in points slightly to make them harder targets for To the Last. That's the secondary objective where you have 3 big units and you have to try and keep them alive all game. And Plague Burst Crawlers were kind of ideal for this. Really tough tanks that were happy to sit at the back and could still function if they even completely hid out of line of sight. I don't know if that was their intention. It certainly means that they're going to cost less points now, so things like Death Shroud Terminators would now be bigger squads for that secondary. But I think if that's the reason, it is kind of a dumb reason. It's more of a fault with the secondary than with Death Guard itself, and it's really not helped the internal balance of the Codex. If you compare these guys to things like Land Raiders or Chaos Predators, they're just laughably better for the points cost, and those things didn't see drops whatsoever. Drops to the Demon Engines might be good for allied Chaos lists though. Some armies did use the 3 Plague Burst Crawlers plus a character in a Spearhead detachment. Now that strategy seems better than ever to be honest, and doubly so if you're running an Epidemius list, one that can get some further unintended bonuses for the big Demon Engines from out of Codex. Finally, and what I think is probably one of the better changes out of the update, is the Mephitic Blight Hauler going down 10 points. They've dropped down to 130 from 140, a 7% reduction, and I think that feels about right. They were an okay unit before. Some people were making good use of them at tournaments, again particularly with Epidemius as he works well with them. But unless you're running absolutely loads of Demon Engines, I feel like Plague Burst Crawlers were the priority before, and now they've got an even bigger points reduction, I think they're still going to remain the first choice. I wouldn't be running Mephitic Blight Haulers myself, unless there were at least 3 Plague Burst Crawlers already in the army. So overall, I do think it's a pretty weird set of changes for the Death Guard. In general, it looks like Games Workshop largely set out to nerf them, and I think that they've succeeded in doing so. Though I guess aside from the Plague Burst Crawler change, you might be able to argue that the rest of the Codex is now a bit more internally balanced perhaps. Units like Plague Marines and Possessed might have a bit more room to shine over the Terminators, and certainly a few of the more auto-include units have been reined in. Still though, I think maybe for the Death Guard, the way that they should have done it might have been for some small buffs. I think if it were me, I probably would have left the Terminators alone, and given units like Plague Marines, Possessed, Land Raiders and Predators small points drops. I feel like that could have created a bit more internal balance within the Codex, without having to weaken them as a faction to do so. In any case, it does seem that top Death Guard armies are going to be looking a lot more Demon Engine-y in the future. Perhaps Crawlers, Blight Haulers and Bloat Drones might be the way to go, backed up by Epidemius perhaps. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments below. What do you like and dislike about the changes, and how might you have done it differently? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and hopefully with a far more normal sounding voice again in the near future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is down in the video description. It is what supports me to keep on making these videos, and it's quite a big motivation to keep on making them, even when my vocal cords are trying to give up on me. I do try and give a fair few benefits for patrons, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.